The locks were different. I noticed it before I even got out of the truck. The way the porch light hit the brick in a way it never had before. A stranger's shine on a door I had walked through for 31 years. My name is Walter Coleman. I am 66 years old, a retired structural engineer, 20 years a soldier before that. And on the night I am about to tell you about, I stood on my own front porch, holding a casserole dish someone from the church had pressed into my hands after my wife's funeral, and I could not get into my own house. There was a note taped to the door at eye level, printed on plain paper, folded once. I remember my hands were shaking when I unfolded it, and I remember thinking, stupidly, that Eleanor would have been furious about the tape pulling paint off the door. The note was from my son. Dad, it read. We didn't want to do this the hard way, but Ashley and I talked it over, and it's better this way. The house is too much for you alone. We found you a nice place at Cedar Grove. First month's already paid. Locks are new for security. We'll bring your things by tomorrow. Please don't make this difficult. We love you, Derek. I stood there in the dark with a casserole dish going cold in my hands, and I read that note 3 times before I understood it wasn't a joke. My wife had been buried 9 hours earlier. Her flowers were still fresh on the grave. And my son had used those 9 hours to change the locks on the house his mother and I built our whole life inside. I want to tell you how we got here, because a man doesn't get locked out of his own home in one evening. It takes years. It takes 1,000 small permissions given away, without noticing. 1,000 times you tell yourself your children love you, and surely wouldn't. Until the night you're standing on a porch with a cooling dish of chicken and rice, staring at a lock that doesn't know you anymore. Eleanor and I met in a laundromat in 1983. I was 3 years out of the army, working construction to pay for night classes in engineering, and she was a nursing student who kept feeding quarters into a dryer that ate them without turning. I fixed the machine because I couldn't stand watching her lose another quarter, and she said the only thing she could think to say, which was, "Do you fix everything you see broken?" I told her I tried. 41 years later, on the morning she died, I was still trying, and there was nothing left to fix. She fought the cancer for 2 years. Pancreatic, they told us early, the kind that doesn't leave much room for hope but leaves plenty of room for suffering in between. I retired from the firm the week after her diagnosis. I didn't ask Derek or his wife Ashley for help, not once, not because I was too proud, though I suppose I was, but because Eleanor asked me not to. She said, "Walter, our son has enough on his plate. Let us carry what's ours." I didn't understand until much later how much she was already carrying that I didn't know about. Derek is 38 now. He runs, or ran, a contracting business he started 9 years ago, with money I never mentioned I'd lent him. Because Eleanor asked me not to mention it, and because some part of me knew that if he thought of it as a loan from his father instead of his own success, it would cost him something I didn't want to take. Ashley is his wife of 6 years. Sharp, capable, the kind of woman who color codes a spreadsheet before she color codes her closet. I liked her in the beginning. I want to be honest about that, because this isn't a story where the daughter-in-law arrives already wearing a villain's coat. She arrived carrying casseroles and asking good questions about my hip replacement. It took years for the coat to grow on her, thread by thread, mostly stitched by fear. The first thread I remember pulling loose, though I didn't recognize it as loose at the time, came about 8 months before Eleanor died. Derek's business had lost a contract, a big one, a mixed-use development downtown that fell through when the developer went bankrupt. Derek didn't tell us the numbers, but I know construction, and I know what a lost contract that size does to a small outfit's cash flow. Ashley started coming to Sunday dinner with her laptop open at the table, which Eleanor found rude but never said so, because Eleanor believed you let your children keep their dignity even when they were losing it in front of you. One Sunday, Ashley asked, almost as an aside, whether we'd ever thought about what happens to the house someday. Eleanor said we'd made arrangements, which was true, though Ashley didn't know what those arrangements were, and neither, at the time, did I fully understand how carefully my wife had made them. Ashley smiled and said she only asked because it's smart to plan ahead, especially with rising interest rates, especially with the market the way it is. I remember thinking it was a strange thing to bring up over pot roast. I didn't think it was a strategy. I think now that it was the first knock on a door, Ashley had already decided, somewhere private in her own mind, that she intended to walk through. The second thread came 6 months before Eleanor died, when Ashley began stopping by on weekday afternoons while I was at chemo appointments with Eleanor, ostensibly to check on the house, water the plants, bring in the mail. I didn't think anything of it. Family helps family. It was Frank Delgado, my oldest friend from my army days, who first said something that stuck with me. Frank had come by to fix a gutter and mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd seen Ashley's car in the driveway 3 afternoons that week, and that she'd been in the garage a long time for someone just checking on plants. I told Frank he was being suspicious of nothing, that Ashley was just being helpful. Frank said, "Walter, I've known you since Fort Benning, and you've never once in your life mistaken helpful for something else. Think about it." I didn't think about it. Not really. Not until it was too late to matter. The third thread, the one I should have pulled hardest, came 4 months before Eleanor died. On a Tuesday, I remember, because it was the day the oncologist told us the treatments weren't working anymore, only managing now, not fighting. We came home exhausted, grief already settling into the house like weather, and found an envelope on the kitchen counter from Ashley. Inside was a document, a power of attorney form, already filled out with our names, needing only signatures, granting Derek authority over our financial and medical decisions should we become, in the document's careful language, unable to manage our own affairs. There was a sticky note on top in Ashley's handwriting, just a precaution. It read, "Better safe than sorry, no rush." Eleanor read it standing at the counter, still wearing her coat. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she folded the document back into its envelope, set it in a drawer, and said, "We'll think about it," which in 41 years of marriage I had learned meant absolutely not, but said in a way that wouldn't start a war. That night, after I thought she was asleep, I found her at the kitchen table with a legal pad, writing something in the small, careful handwriting she used for anything she considered important. I asked what she was doing. She said, "Making sure your father's tools stay yours no matter what," which didn't make sense to me at the time, because I hadn't inherited any tools from my father worth protecting. I understand now she wasn't talking about tools. She was talking about me. I didn't know, until 3 weeks after her funeral, that my wife had spent the last 8 months of her life on the phone with a lawyer named Patricia Hale, a woman she'd found through the hospital's patient advocacy office, a woman who specialized, as it turned out, in exactly the kind of quiet family erosion Eleanor had started to see coming the moment that power of attorney form landed on our kitchen counter. I didn't know Eleanor had been documenting things. I didn't know she'd been writing letters. I didn't know, until a courtroom quiet office 3 weeks later, that my wife had spent her dying breath building me a door that no one, not even our son, would be able to lock me out of. But that was 3 weeks away. On the night of the funeral, all I knew was that I was standing on a porch that used to be mine, holding a dish of cold chicken and rice, staring at a lock I didn't have a key for, in a house where my wife's reading glasses were probably still sitting on the nightstand, exactly where she'd left them the last time she was well enough to read. I called Derek. It rang 4 times before he picked up, and I could hear Ashley's voice in the background, low, saying something I couldn't make out. "Dad," he said before I could speak, "I know you're upset. Just, please, don't make a scene. The neighbors." "I'm standing on my own porch, Derek," I said. "There isn't going to be a scene. There's just going to be a question. Where am I supposed to sleep tonight?" There was a silence on the line long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then he said, "We already paid the deposit at Cedar Grove. It's a nice place, Dad, really. It's got a dining hall, activities, people your age. You'll like it once you settle in." "I have a house," I said. "Your mother and I paid it off 11 years ago. I don't need a facility. I need my key back." Ashley thinks he started and stopped and started again. "We think it's better this way. The house is a lot of upkeep for one person. And with everything with the estate, it's just simpler if we handle the logistics now instead of later." I asked him what he meant by the estate, since your mother has been gone less than half a day. And he didn't have an answer for that. Not one he was willing to say out loud on the phone, standing on a porch in the dark with a dish going cold. I want to tell you I was angry in that moment, the kind of righteous fury you see in movies. But honestly, what I felt was smaller and worse than anger. I felt like a man watching a door close very slowly and very politely, the kind of closing that doesn't slam, doesn't shout, just clicks, soft as a lock turning, and leaves you standing in the cold, wondering if you imagine the whole house was ever yours. I didn't argue further. 41 years with Eleanor had taught me that some doors don't open no matter how long you stand knocking, and the wise thing is to walk to a door that will. I called Frank. Frank Delgado picked up on the second ring the way he always has, like he keeps the phone in his hand out of habit from decades of waiting for orders. "Walter," he said, "what's wrong?" I told him about the note, about the locks, about Cedar Grove and the deposit already paid, about Derek's voice going thin and apologetic on the other end of the line while somewhere behind him, Ashley murmured directions like a stage manager. Frank didn't say "I told you so," though he'd earned the right to. He just said, "Come to my place, guest rooms made up, and don't argue with me either, because I've had a longer day than you have watching you not listen to me for the last 6 months." I slept that night in Frank's guest room under a quilt his late wife had made, and I did not sleep well. And somewhere around 3 in the morning I got up and sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee I didn't want and thought about Eleanor's hands. I thought about the last time she squeezed mine, 2 days before she died, in a hospital bed with a window that looked out on a parking garage instead of a garden, and how she'd said, "Walter, promise me you won't let them make you small." I'd told her I promised, the way you promise anything to a dying woman, meaning it and not fully understanding what it would cost to keep. I understood a little more the next morning, when Frank set a cup of coffee in front of me and said, "Before you do anything else today, you're calling Patricia Hale." I didn't know who Patricia Hale was. Frank said Eleanor had given him a card 3 months earlier, on one of the afternoons I'd been at physical therapy for my knee, and Eleanor had insisted on being alone for an hour, which I'd assumed was rest and had actually been, it turned out, a meeting in our own kitchen with a lawyer while Ashley's car sat in our driveway watering plants that didn't need watering. Frank said Eleanor had told him, "If anything ever happens with the house, you call this number before you call anyone else, and don't ask me why. Just do it." Frank had kept the card in his wallet for 3 months, waiting, he said, for a reason he hoped he'd never need. He set it on the table in front of me. Patricia Hale, attorney at law, estate and elder protection. I called the number with my hands not quite steady. A receptionist answered, and when I gave my name there was a pause, a shuffle of papers, and then she said, "Oh, Mr. Coleman, Ms. Hale has been expecting your call. Can you come in this morning? I want you to sit with that for a second," the way I had to sit with it in Frank's kitchen. My wife had been dead less than 20 hours. My son had locked me out of my own house, and a lawyer I had never met in my life was expecting my call, because my wife, in the last months of her life, while I thought she was resting, while I thought Ashley was watering plants, had been quietly building something to catch me before I hit the ground. I didn't understand yet what it was. I only understood that for the first time since the funeral, since the locks, since the note taped crooked to my own front door, I felt something other than grief and humiliation sitting in my chest. I felt the smallest, strangest flicker of hope, the kind you feel when you realize someone loved you carefully enough to plan for a day you never wanted to imagine, and loved you so completely that even after she was gone, she still had one more thing to give me. Patricia Hale's office was on the 3rd floor of a modest brick building downtown, nothing flashy. A waiting room with 2 ferns and a coffee machine that had seen better decades. She came out to greet me herself instead of sending an assistant, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair pulled back tight and reading glasses pushed up on her head. And the first thing she said to me, before hello, before condolences, was, "Mr. Coleman, I am so sorry. And I am not surprised at all that you're sitting in my waiting room this morning because your wife told me this exact thing might happen." We sat in her office, and she opened a file that was thicker than I expected, and she told me things about my own marriage I didn't know. things Eleanor had never mentioned in 41 years of falling asleep beside me. 8 months earlier, after that power of attorney form landed on our kitchen counter, Eleanor had come to Patricia not for a form, but for a fortress. She had told Patricia everything, the afternoons Ashley spent in our garage under the pretense of watering plants, the careful comments about the market and interest rates dropped over pot roast, a conversation Eleanor had overheard, unintentionally, standing behind the pantry door one afternoon when Ashley thought no one else was home. Ashley on the phone with someone, saying, "Once the old man's gone too, we won't need to deal with any of this. We can finally breathe." Patricia looked at me across her desk and said, "Your wife didn't want to fight, Mr. Coleman. She wanted a door that would already be built by the time anyone tried to force one shut. 8 years ago, long before any of this, you and Eleanor set up something together. Do you remember?" I did remember, vaguely. The way you remember paperwork from a decade ago, a visit to a different lawyer back when Eleanor's mother passed and left her a modest inheritance, some talk of trusts and taxes that I'd mostly let Eleanor handle because she was better with that kind of thing than I was, better with patience for small print. I told Patricia I remembered signing something, but couldn't tell her exactly what. Patricia slid a folder across the desk. 8 years ago, she said, Eleanor placed the house and the majority of your joint savings into an irrevocable trust. You are the sole beneficiary, not Derek, not any future spouse of Derek's. You, Walter Coleman, specifically by name, with a clause Eleanor insisted on adding herself, one that names any attempt by a third party to gain power of attorney or property control through pressure, deception, or what the law calls undue influence, as immediate grounds for the trust to trigger full legal protection, including the right to reclaim any property removed from your possession under those circumstances. I sat there in that office with 2 ferns and old coffee, and did not fully understand what she was telling me until she said it plainer. "Walter," she said, "your house was never in danger of being taken from you, not really. Not legally. No matter what locks anyone changed last night. Eleanor made sure of that 8 years ago, quietly, patiently, the way I understand she did most things. What we need to do now is make it official, in front of your son, in front of his wife, so there's no more confusion about who this house belongs to." I asked her when. She said, "This week, before your son and his wife try to sell it, because Ashley had already called 2 real estate agents in the last 5 days." A fact Patricia had learned from a probate notice that had crossed her desk that very morning, an early inquiry someone had filed with the county assessor's office about the property's value, filed under Ashley Coleman's name. 5 days, I said. My wife has been gone 5 days and someone was already asking what the house was worth. Patricia didn't flinch from the question, and she didn't soften it either, which I respected. She said, "Grief moves at different speeds in different people, Mr. Coleman. In some people, grief and greed arrive on the same morning, and it isn't always easy to tell, from the outside, which one is driving the car." I asked her about Derek specifically because some part of me, even sitting in that office with the proof spread across the desk, wanted there to be an innocent explanation for my son, wanted to believe he was a passenger and not a driver. Patricia was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet lawyers use when they're choosing to be kind instead of precise. She said, "Your wife's letter might answer that better than I can. She kept a letter for you. She asked me to give it to you, only after all of this had already started, not before, because she didn't want you living in suspicion of your own son while she was still alive to see it hurt you." She handed me an envelope, cream-colored, my name written across the front in Eleanor's small, careful handwriting, the same handwriting from the legal pad I'd seen her writing on the night that form landed on our counter. I did not open it in that office. I put it in my jacket pocket, next to my heart, the way you'd carry something you weren't ready to know yet, and I asked Patricia one more question before I left. I asked her what happens next. She told me. A meeting had already been scheduled, she said, for the coming Friday, 4 days away, called by Ashley herself, who had contacted the family's longtime estate attorney of record, believing that attorney to be a family friend who would help settle things quickly and quietly. What Ashley did not know, what Derek likely did not know either, was that the attorney of record Eleanor had used for the trust 8 years ago, and the attorney Ashley had just called to fast track a probate she assumed would favor her, were one and the same person, sitting across the desk from me in that office with two tired ferns. Ashley thinks she is walking into a meeting to settle an estate. Quickly, Patricia said, folding her hands. She has no idea she is walking into a room where the trust already settled everything 8 years ago, and where the only thing left to happen is for everyone at that table to finally hear it out loud. I spent the 4 days before that meeting at Frank's kitchen table mostly not sleeping, mostly staring at the cream-colored envelope without opening it, the way you'll circle a door for days before you finally turn the handle. Derek called twice. Both times I let it ring. Not out of spite, I told myself, but because I didn't trust my own voice yet. Didn't trust what would come out of me if I picked up before I understood exactly what my wife had been protecting me from. On the second night, my grandson Ethan called instead, using his mother's phone without her knowing, which I only found out later. He's 10, and he asked me, in the plain, unguarded way only a 10-year-old can manage, why Grandpa's things were in boxes in the garage. I asked him what he meant. He said Mom had been packing up my study, the room where I kept my old drafting tables and Eleanor's sewing machine and 40 years of photographs, and had told him it was going to a nice new office for Dad's business. I told Ethan it was fine, that grown-ups were sorting some things out, the kind of lie you tell a child to protect him from a truth that isn't his to carry yet. He said, "Okay, but Grandma's sewing machine is really heavy. Are you sure it's supposed to go?" And something in his voice, worried and careful, cracked something loose in my chest that I'd been holding shut since the porch, since the note, since the locks. I told him I loved him, and to go find his mother's phone before she noticed it missing, and I sat at Frank's table after that call and finally opened Eleanor's letter. I am not going to tell you everything that letter said, because some of it belongs only to me, the way certain things a wife says to a husband in her last months belong only to the two of them even after one of them is gone. But I will tell you the parts that matter to this story. Eleanor wrote that she had known, longer than she'd let on, that something in Derek had grown afraid of not having enough ever since his business nearly failed, and that fear, in people who love us, doesn't always look like fear from the outside. Sometimes it looks like a spreadsheet open at Sunday dinner. Sometimes it looks like a power of attorney form on a kitchen counter with a sticky note that says just a precaution. She wrote that she didn't believe Derek was a bad man, only a frightened one, and that frightened men sometimes let people who love them less carefully make decisions for them, decisions they'd never make alone. She wrote about Ashley, too, more gently than I expected, though not without clear eyes. She wrote that she'd asked around, quietly, the way mothers-in-law sometimes do, and learned that Ashley's own family had lost their house to foreclosure when Ashley was 12, that Ashley had grown up watching her parents lose the one solid thing a family is supposed to be able to count on, and that Eleanor believed, though she couldn't prove it and wasn't excusing it, that Ashley's need to control our house, our money, our future, wasn't cruelty exactly, but a 12-year-old's terror wearing a 32-year-old's spreadsheet. That doesn't make it right, Eleanor wrote, in that careful handwriting, but it might help you understand it without hating her completely. Because hatred is heavy, Walter, and I don't want you carrying anything heavy after I'm gone. I want you carrying only what's light enough to still let you dance at Ethan's wedding someday. The last page of the letter was the one that undid me completely. Sitting at Frank's table at 11 at night with a cup of coffee gone cold beside me, Eleanor wrote that everything she'd built, the trust, the meetings with Patricia, the careful, quiet fortress constructed over 8 months while I thought she was resting, wasn't built out of distrust of Derek. It was built out of love for both of us, love that refused to let one of us destroy the other through fear. I am not protecting the house from our son, she wrote. I am protecting our son from becoming a man who took his father's house. That is a worse loss than any property, and I refuse to let it happen to either of you, even after I'm not here to stop it in the room myself. Friday came. Patricia's office had been rearranged for the meeting, a longer table brought in, enough chairs for everyone. I arrived early with Frank beside me, who I'd asked to come not for legal reasons, but because a man shouldn't walk into a room like that alone, not after the week I'd had. Derek arrived a few minutes later, looking like he hadn't slept much better than I had, and behind him came Ashley, dressed sharply, carrying a folder of her own, the kind of folder you bring when you believe you're the one steering the meeting. Behind her came her parents, Carol and Michael Reyes, who I hadn't expected, and who I understood later had been invited by Ashley specifically as witnesses, in case she'd apparently told Derek things got emotional and someone needed to keep the peace. Ashley opened the meeting before Patricia even had a chance to. She said she wanted to keep things simple, that the family had been through enough, that the fastest, kindest thing for everyone, especially Dad, she said, using the word dad in a way that had never once sounded natural in 6 years, would be to move forward with selling the house, splitting the proceeds appropriately, and getting me settled somewhere manageable where I wouldn't have to worry about upkeep or bills or being alone. Patricia let her finish completely. That was, I would learn, exactly her style, to let people build their whole house of cards in the open air before showing them the wind was already blowing. Then she opened the folder in front of her, and she said, "Ashley, before we discuss selling anything, I think it's important. Everyone in this room understands the actual legal status of the property in question." She explained the trust. She read the date it was established, 8 years prior, and I watched Ashley's face change in real time, watched the folder in her hands go very slightly still. Patricia explained the sole beneficiary clause, my name specifically, irrevocably, and then she read, slowly, without raising her voice, the clause Eleanor had insisted on adding herself, the one about undue influence, about any attempt to remove property or decision-making authority from me through pressure or deception, and how such an attempt would trigger immediate legal protections and, where applicable, could constitute elder financial exploitation under state law. A phrase that landed in that room like a dropped plate. Ashley said, "That's not... This is a misunderstanding, we would never." And Patricia, still calm, still steady, said, "I have a probate inquiry filed under your name at the county assessor's office 5 days after Eleanor Coleman's death, requesting a valuation on the property currently occupied by her surviving husband. I have Frank Delgado's testimony regarding the timeline and frequency of your visits to the house in the months prior to Eleanor's passing. And I have Eleanor's own letter, written and notarized 8 months ago, documenting a conversation she overheard in her own home regarding her husband's eventual passing that she interpreted, and I would agree, as deeply concerning." Derek turned to Ashley at that point, and I watched my son's face do something I hadn't seen since he was a boy caught in a lie too big to talk his way out of. He said her name, just her name, Ashley, like a question. And Ashley, cornered now, said the thing people say when the truth has finally caught up faster than they can outrun it. She said, "I was trying to protect our family, Derek. Someone had to think about the future. Your father can't run that house forever. And I was tired. I am so tired of being the only one who plans ahead while everyone else just waits for things to fall apart." I hadn't planned to speak. I'd told myself, walking into that office, that I would let Patricia handle the legal part and stay quiet the way I'd stayed quiet through most of my life, the way Eleanor used to tease me about, organizing coffee cans in the garage instead of saying what I felt. But something about watching my son's face break in front of me made the quiet finally crack. I said, "Ashley, I understand you're afraid. My wife understood it too, more than you know, more than I think you'd want me to say out loud in front of your parents. But you didn't have a conversation with me. You didn't sit at my kitchen table and say, 'Walter, we're worried. We want to help you plan.' You waited until my wife was in the ground and changed the locks on my house while I was still wearing my funeral suit. That isn't planning ahead. That's taking, dressed up in nicer words." Nobody said anything for a long moment. Ashley's mother, Carol, who I hadn't expected to speak at all, said quietly, "Ashley, is that true about the locks?" And Ashley didn't answer, which was its own answer, and Carol closed her eyes the way a parent does when they finally see, in full daylight, something they'd been avoiding looking at directly for a long time. Derek didn't say much in that room. He sat very still, staring at the folder in front of him, and when he finally spoke, it wasn't to defend Ashley and it wasn't to attack her either. He said, "I need some time," and he stood up, and he left the room without looking at anyone, and Ashley, after a long frozen moment, gathered her folder and followed him out, and her parents followed after that, and the office went very quiet, except for the sound of the old coffee machine cycling in the waiting room. One, orchestrated continuation of sequential narrative progression. Orchestrated continuation of sequential narrative progression. Patricia looked at me and said, "The trust stands, Walter. The house is yours. It was always yours." Nothing that happened this week could have changed that, not legally, though I understand it didn't feel that way standing on your own porch with a casserole dish in your hands. I thanked her, and I meant it more deeply than the words could carry, but I didn't feel triumphant sitting in that office. I felt tired and sad and strangely, achingly proud of a wife who had loved me carefully enough, 8 years in advance, to build a door I wouldn't need until the worst week of my life. I thought about her legal pad at the kitchen table, her small, careful handwriting, making sure your father's tools stay yours, and I understood finally, completely, what she'd meant. Derek came to the house 3 days later. I was back in it by then. The locks changed again, this time by a locksmith I'd hired myself, keys only in my own pocket. I was in the garage when I heard his truck pull into the driveway, and for a moment, I considered not going out to meet him, letting him knock, letting him feel for once what it was like to wait on a step, and wonder if the door would open. But that wasn't the kind of man Eleanor had asked me to be. And it wasn't the kind of man I wanted to be either. So I set down the wrench I was holding and walked out to meet my son in the driveway. He looked smaller than I remembered, standing there in his work boots, and he said, "Can we talk?" And I said, "Come on in." And I watched something in his shoulders loosen slightly at those 3 words, like he hadn't been sure I'd say them. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Eleanor had once written on a legal pad while I pretended to be asleep, and for a long while neither of us said anything. Then Derek said, "I found Mom's other letters. Patricia gave them to me yesterday. She said Mom left one for me too, separate from yours." I asked him what it said. He pulled a folded page out of his jacket pocket, worn soft at the creases already from being read too many times in 3 days, and he read it to me instead of summarizing it, which I think took more courage than anything else he did that week. Eleanor had written to her son about the contracting business about a year, 6 years earlier, when it had nearly gone under after that first big contract fell through, before Ashley, before Ethan, back when Derek was drowning quietly, and hadn't told either of us how bad it had gotten. She wrote that she and I had paid off $11,000 of his supplier debt that year, transferred in small amounts over 4 months, so it wouldn't look like a lump sum, timed to arrive right when his accounts were emptiest, and that we told him, when he asked, confused, how his numbers had somehow balanced, that we'd simply been thinking about downsizing anyway, that the truck was getting old regardless, that we didn't need the money as much as he thought we did. None of that was true, she wrote. Your father drove that same 12-year-old truck 4 more years because we needed every dollar to go to you instead. He never told you. He never told me he minded. He just kept driving it. And every time you complimented him on how well he kept an old truck running, some tired part of him lit up like a boy given a medal, because it meant you never had to know what it cost him to keep you standing. Derek's voice broke reading that part, and he set the letter down on the table and put both hands over his face, and I did something I hadn't done with my son since he was small enough to carry on my shoulders. I got up, walked around the table, and put my hand on the back of his neck the way I used to when he was little and scared of thunderstorms, and I let him cry without saying anything at all. Because some things don't need a father's words as much as they need a father's hand. When he could speak again, he said, "I let her push for the locks because I was ashamed, Dad." Ashley kept saying the business was struggling again, that we were drowning, that the only way we'd ever get solid ground under us was the house, was you settled somewhere smaller, so we could access what she called the equity. I told myself it was practical. I told myself you'd understand once you saw the numbers. I didn't want to admit, even to myself, that I was doing to you exactly what I would have been furious to learn someone had done to Mom. I asked him gently what he wanted to do about Ashley, and he said he didn't know yet, that they'd be seeing a counselor, that her parents had already had a hard conversation with her about the foreclosure she grew up with, and how it had apparently been quietly steering more decisions in their marriage than either of them had let themselves see clearly. I told him that wasn't my fight to referee, that Eleanor herself had written she didn't want me carrying hatred, only enough understanding to keep from carrying something heavier. What I wanted from him, I said, wasn't an apology delivered once and filed away. I wanted to see, over time, in small ordinary Tuesdays and Sundays, whether the man sitting across from me now was going to be the man who showed up the way his mother had shown up for 41 years, without once needing a spreadsheet to prove her love was real. He asked what that would look like. I told him I honestly didn't know yet either, that grief doesn't come with instructions, but that I'd know it when I saw it, the way you know a house is built on solid ground by how it stands through weather, not by how it looks on a dry afternoon. The weeks after that were slow, the way real healing usually is, nothing like the fast, tidy version people want to believe in. Derek started showing up on Wednesday mornings, before his job sites opened, bringing coffee, sitting with me on the back porch for 20 minutes before he had to go. Not always talking, sometimes just sitting, which I came to understand was its own kind of language between us. He never once brought up the house again except to ask if the gutters needed clearing before winter, and the first time he asked that, instead of asking about equity or square footage, something in my chest that had been clenched since the porch and the casserole dish finally, quietly let go. Ethan started coming with him some Wednesdays, and one Saturday in October, he wandered into the garage the way children do, drawn by curiosity to the shelves of tools I'd spent 40 years collecting. He asked if I'd teach him to use them, the way his father had asked, decades before, in that same garage. We spent the whole afternoon building a birdhouse together, his measurements crooked, his first 3 cuts wasted, his patience thinning, and then, slowly, deepening the way patience does when a grandfather doesn't rush a child through frustration. By sundown, the birdhouse leaned slightly to one side, and Ethan frowned at it and said it wasn't very good. I told him what I'd told his father once, a long time ago, that nothing built by hand is ever perfect, that the only thing that matters is whether the foundation holds. He looked at the little crooked house for a long moment and said, "But if the foundation's good, it'll still stand." "Right, Grandpa, even if it's a little crooked." I told him that was exactly right, and I had a feeling, watching him carry that birdhouse home under his arm, that he'd remember that afternoon a great deal longer than he'd remember how crooked the roofline had turned out. Ashley did not come to Sunday dinners for a long while, and when she finally did, months later, it was quiet and careful, and neither of us pretended the last year hadn't happened. She apologized to me directly, once, at the kitchen table, without an audience, without her parents present to soften the room. She said she didn't expect me to forgive her quickly, and I told her I didn't expect myself to either, but that Eleanor had asked me not to carry hatred, and I intended to keep that promise even when it was hard, especially when it was hard, because that was the whole point of a promise. I won't tell you everything healed perfectly between us. It didn't. Some doors, once cracked, never sit quite flush in their frames again. But she stopped color-coding her fear into spreadsheets at my table, and some Sundays that was enough. In November, the local senior center asked me to speak at an event on elder financial protection, after word had somehow traveled, the way it does in smaller communities, about what Patricia Hale's office had uncovered. I nearly declined. Public speaking had never been something I sought out, and I had no interest in becoming a cautionary tale recited at community centers. But I thought about Eleanor's letter, about her writing that if your experience can help someone else, it stops being only your story, and I found I couldn't say no to that thought once it had settled in. The room was full of people my age and older, and a fair number of adult children too, which surprised me, and when it came time for questions, a woman near the back raised her hand and asked how I'd known, really known, that something was wrong before it became impossible to ignore. I told her the truth. I said I hadn't known, not clearly, not in time to stop the locks from changing. What I'd had instead was a wife who noticed before I did, who paid attention to small things, an afternoon car in a driveway too often, a sticky note that said just a precaution, and who loved me carefully enough to act on what she noticed instead of dismissing it as nothing. I told the room that the lesson wasn't really about locks or trusts or lawyers, important as those things turned out to be. The lesson was that love pays attention long before it needs to defend itself. And if the people around you never seem to notice the small things, that itself is worth noticing. On what would have been Eleanor's 65th birthday, the whole family gathered in the backyard, the same yard where her roses were still blooming, tended now by Derek on Wednesday mornings before work, a habit he'd taken up without my asking. Ethan chased a dog we'd adopted from the shelter that sprang between the rose bushes. Ashley brought a store-bought cake because she'd finally admitted, laughing despite herself, that she'd never once successfully baked anything Eleanor would have approved of, and everybody laughed with her, and it felt, for the first time in a long while, like laughter that didn't have a spreadsheet hiding underneath it. We left an empty chair at the table, the way we had at every gathering since the funeral, not because we believed Eleanor was sitting in it, but because some absences deserve a seat anyway, a place at the table that says, "You built this," even if you can't be here to see it standing. Derek stood at one point with a glass of lemonade and said he wanted to say something, and the yard went quiet the way yards do when a grown man is about to say something he's been working up the courage to say for months. He said, "For a long time I thought being a good son, a good husband, a good father, meant making sure nobody in this family ever had to worry about money again. I let that goal get so big it swallowed the actual people I was supposed to be protecting." He looked at me. "Dad, I can't undo the weak. I locked you out of your own house. I'm not going to stand here and pretend one speech fixes that. But I can promise you'll never again wonder, for even one night, whether there's a door in this family that's open to you." He raised his glass toward the empty chair. "To Mom," he said, "who built the door before any of us knew we'd need it." I looked around that yard, at my son who had finally, slowly, become a man his mother would recognize again, at my grandson chasing a dog through rose bushes he didn't yet know had been planted the same spring. Eleanor and I bought this house at Ashley, imperfect and trying, at Frank sitting quietly by the fence the way old soldiers do at family gatherings, present and watchful and glad to be included. I thought about the porch, the casserole dish, the note taped crooked to a door that used to know my hand on the knob without needing to think about it. Families are rarely destroyed in a single terrible evening. They are worn down slowly, by fear dressed up as planning, by silence mistaken for peace, by children who love their parents and still, somehow, convince themselves that taking is a form of protecting. And sometimes, if you are fortunate enough to have been loved by someone who paid quiet, careful attention long before the trouble arrived, families are rebuilt slowly too. One Wednesday morning, one crooked bars, one empty chair kept at the table out of respect instead of habit. If this story reminds you of a door that's grown quieter than it used to be, of a parent whose small things you stopped noticing, I hope you'll go back before someone else changes the locks on what's left of your time together. Love isn't proven in a single dramatic gesture. It's proven in whether you show up on the ordinary Wednesday, whether you notice the sticky note that says just a precaution, and ask why it's there before it's too late to ask. Thank you for spending your time with my family's story.